Silver on the Tree by Susan Cooper, Part 4, The Midsummer Tree, Chapter 20, One Goes Alone. They stood in silence about the tree, unable to speak. High up where the last few tatters of storm cloud blew dark across the sun, Hearn the antlered hunter put back his fierce head and gave a long triumphant cry, the gathering call that is lifted up by the horn when the quarry is slain. His white mare leapt across the sky, whinnying high and clear like the singing of the wind on a hill, curving down to a place where the stream of high wind-blown cloud lay like a river across the sky. Out and down the hunter leapt, and in the very instant that he seemed to plunge into the river of sky and disappear, instead they saw sailing out from the same point the great ship Predwyn, graceful and high-powered, with the green standard of the Lord Arthur rippling out at bow and stern. Closer and closer she came, sailing on the wind, and among the six beside the tree Will saw Bran slowly rise the sword Arias, thrust it down into the scabbard, visible now at his side. It was a strange, reluctant gesture that Will could not interpret. He stared at his friend, at the pale face and the tawny eyes beneath the white hair, but he could see no expression there. As Bran watched the long ship sail toward them down the sky, he found himself reflecting instead, not for the first time, that Bran's golden eyes were curiously like those of the wild huntsman Hearn. And then the ship Predwyn was upon them, and he was looking instead at the blue-gray eyes and the weathered, brindle-bearded face of the leader king, Arthur. Arthur was looking past him at the fragile, slim, blue-robed figure of the lady, standing a little apart from them all. He stepped from the prow of the boat where he stood and down to the land, and he knelt on one knee before the lady and bent his head. "Madam," he said, his voice as warm with the with the pleasure of the living as when Will had first heard it. "Your boatman awaits." Will stood with his head singing in bewilderment, feeling the baffled awe of the three Drews beside him. The lady came forward to the boat with a beckoning touch on Arthur's arm and the casual closeness of those who belong to the same family. "It is done," she said. Suddenly there was a deep weariness in the music of her voice that spoke of great age in spite of the calm, ageless beauty of her fine-boned face. "Our task is accomplished, and we may leave the last and longest task to those who inherit this world and all its perilous beauty." She looked back at them all, and as if in farewell, she smiled at Barney, at Simon, and more lingeringly at Jane. Then she looked at John Rawlins, standing empty-eyed and stiff beside the broad oak tree, and she moved swiftly to him and took both his hands. Rawlins looked at her, his dark Welsh face drawn down by lines at nose and mouth that had never seemed so marked before. "John," the lady said softly, "in all this great matter you have done more for your world than any of us, even before your courage at the end. You could have retreated into an unseeing happiness of your own, and yet gave it up. You are a good and honest man, and for a time now you must be an unhappy man. But it is only for a time." She released his hands, but still gazed commandingly into his eyes, and John Rawlins looked back at her without awe or subservience, and shrugged. He said nothing. "You have made a hard choice," the lady said, "and lost the pattern of your life. Thereby I cannot give you back your Bloodwyn, that ambitious fallen figure, but I can give you another chance greater than the first. In a moment you will be back in your own world and time, and there you will find that the appearance of your wife has had some tragic accident and died. It is for you to decide whether or not in that moment you want to still remember all that has happened to you. You may indeed remember the hard truth about the light and the dark, and the true nature of your wife if you wish." John Rawlins said expressionless, half to himself, "It is very strange that there was one thing she would never tell me. It was a joke with her, that she would never tell me where or when she was born." The lady reached out a hand in pity and let it fall. Or, she said gently, instead you may forget. You may, if you wish, forget all that you have seen of the Lord of the dark and light, and although you will then have perhaps a deeper grief at the loss of your wife, you will mourn her and remember her as the woman you knew and loved. That would be living a lie, John Rowland said. No, Merriman said, behind him very strong and deep. No, John, for you did love her, and all love has great value. Every human being who loves another loves imperfection, and there is no perfect being on this earth. Nothing is so simple as that. It is for you to choose, the lady said, and she moved to the boat and paused beside it, looking back. John Rowlands stood facing them, still without visible emotion. Then he turned his dark eyes to the lady, and a warmth came into them. I cannot choose this time, he said with a wry smile. Not such a choice as this. Will you, by your grace, do it for me? Very well, the lady said. She raised her arm, pointing. Walk away from me, John Rowlands, and when you turn, you will find a path at your feet. Follow it. In the moment that you pass the one tree, you will be gone from here, and instead be on another path in your own valley that you know far better than this. And whatever it is in your mind, then will be whatever choice I have made for you. And we wish you well. John Rowlands bent his head for an instant, then looked from one to another of them with a half-smile that held no happiness, but with great affection he looked at Bran. Mi wella, I tin, Huaric, Lachtan, he said, and then he turned and walked away toward the immense spreading oak, on a path that no one else could see, and he drew level with the tree, and he was no longer there. The lady sighed. He shall forget, she said. It is better so. Arthur put out a hand to her. She stepped down into the boat. A rising wind blew, rocking Prydwen on the river of the sky, and suddenly Will had the sense once more of a huge throng, and knew that all the old ones of the circle were making their way aboard to sail with the lady and the king. At the ship's mainmast now the vast sail rose, square, billowing, marked with the cross within a circle, the sign of the light. He heard the cries of sailors, timbers creaked, halyards clattered against spars. Will glanced at the three Drews beside him and saw on their faces the beginning anguish of loss and a long emptiness. But he could not keep his eyes for more than a moment from the great ship. He looked back, and in the ghostly throng of beings on her decks he saw one quick flash after another the faces of those he had known on this journey and on other journeys in this time and in other times. A tall burly figure in a smith's apron raised a long hammer in salute. He saw a bright-eyed small man in a green coat wave to him, and an imperious gray-haired lady leaning on a stick make him a formal little bow. He had a flash of a smile from a stout brown-faced man with a tonsure of white hair. He saw Glyndor and the frail form of the king of the lost land, and then, with a jerk of his heart, he saw Gwion looking at him, smiling his brilliant smile. Then the wind began to grow stronger out of the clouds, and the sail billowed and flapped as if impatient, and the faces merged into the misty crowd. Arthur stood on the prow, his bearded head outlined against the sky, and held out his hand to Bran. His warm voice rang out, triumphant and welcoming. Come, my son. Bran came quickly toward him, then paused. He was close to Merriman, his white hair and pale face almost luminous against Merriman's deep blue cloak. Will looked on sadly, knowing it would be for the last time, seeing in Bran's face a mixture of longing and determination and regret. Come, my son, said the warm, deep voice again. The long task of the light is over, and the world is freed of the peril of the dominion of the dark. Now it is all a matter for men. The six have performed their great mission, and we have fulfilled our heritage, you and I. And now we may have to rest in the quiet, silver-circled castle at the back of the north wind, among the apple trees, and those we leave behind may think of us in greeting each night when the crown of the north wind, The corona borealis rises above the horizon in a circlet of stars. He reached out an arm again. Come, there is a tide in this matter, which is almost at the full, and I do not sail on the ebb. Bran looked at him in yearning, but said clearly, I cannot come, my lord. There was a silence, into which only the wind sang softly. Arthur let his arm come slowly down to his side. Bran said, stumbling, It is what Gwion said when the lost land was to be drowned and he would not leave it. I belong here. If it is a matter for men now, as you say, then the men are going to have a hard time of it. Perhaps there are things later that I might be able to do to help. Even if there are not, still I belong. Loving bonds, Merriman said. That's what I have here. And he said, he was looking up at Merriman beside him, that those bonds are outside the high magic, even because they are the strongest thing on this earth. Merriman stirred. From his mind, Will could feel something like awe. That is true, Merriman said. But consider well, Bran, if you give up your place in the high magic, your identity in the time that is outside time, then you will be no more than mortal, like Jane and Simon and Barney here. You will be the Pendragon no longer. You will remember nothing that has happened. You will live and die as all men do. You must give up the chance of going out of time with those of the light, as I shall go before long, and as one day long hence will go too. And you will never see your High Father again. Bran turned sharply toward Arthur, and as he watched the two stare at one another, Will saw again the tawny eyes of Herne the Hunter in Bran's face, and yet a look of Arthur too, as if all three were one and the same. He blinked, wondering. All at once Arthur said, proud and loving, and he said softly, Go where you feel you should go, my son, Bran Davies of Clued, and my blessing go with you. He stepped down over the side of the boat, again to the grassy bank, and held his arms open. Bran ran to him, and for a moment they stood close. Then Arthur stepped back, smiling, and Bran, looking up at him, all the while drew Arias, white and gleaming, from the scabbard at his side, slipped the sword belt over his head, and held out both sword and scabbard to his father. Will heard Merriman sigh gently, as if in release, and found his own fists unwittingly clenched. And Arthur took Arias in one hand and the scabbard in the other, and sheathed the sword. He looked for a moment past Bran to Merriman, and his eyes smiled, though his mouth was serious now. I will see you in a little while, my lion, he said, and Merriman nodded his head. Then the king stepped back into his ship, Prydwen, and the broad sail filled and bellied out. And with all the host of shades of light looking back, without sign of farewell or any ending, the ship sailed across the sky. Small sunlit clouds lay scattered there, so that the blue sky was like a sea scattered with small islands, and there was no telling whether the ship was in the sea or sky when it disappeared. Bran stood watching until there was no ship to watch, but Will could see no regret in his face, and we will pause there.